Hello and welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow here at the center, and I'm very pleased to be hosting a book talk today with Gregory Smith, who is the author of Where Credit is Due: How Africa's Debt Can Be a Benefit, Not a Burden. His new book, first time author actually. This is his first book, I understand. Let me just introduce Greg briefly, and we'll jump into a discussion of the book. Greg is an emerging market funds manager at M&G Investments in London. In addition to his private sector experience, he has had stints at the World Bank. He's been an advisor to African governments on debt issues. And his work has been featured prominently in the financial press globally. I think he's well known in sovereign debt circles, and we're pleased to have him with us at the center. Let me just say about the book, I was eager to have Greg come talk to us about the book, because I really think it's, while it has this regional focus on Africa and is very useful that way, and particularly in the structure of the book, he relies heavily on country case studies. I have to say, as someone who follows the policy side of this debt landscape closely, I really think this book is kind of the best thing going right now, and really understanding the dynamics of the sovereign debt landscape as it pertains to developing economies globally. And I think it really, in a moment, in this crisis moment we have, where things can be fast moving, the picture might change a lot. It is striking, with the long timelines of book publication, how current Greg's discussion is, and how much he really captures, in my view, a lot of what's going on and where the challenges are. So, Greg, welcome. Pleased to have you. I want to jump right into it and simply start by asking you, why'd you write the book?
That's a great question, Scott, and it's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invite. So, the book, it's something I'm very proud of. It's the sort of result of many years of research, and for me, the research has been an opportunity to learn and think about the topic, and it's also something I enjoyed. And I think the major challenge in writing a book on African debt is that you've got sort of 55 countries and such sort of diverse contexts. And I think that's where the interesting part came in, because I sort of decided that I would travel and I would try and build these country stories into the narrative. And I traveled to 26 countries during the book, and lots of wonderful experiences, lots of fascinating conversations with people, and huge generosity along the way. And that alone was enough for me, the huge learning. And it was sort of in capital cities, going out to see large infrastructure projects, and also trips to Washington, DC and China to try and understand it more so from a different creditor perspective was really good. And I kind of hope that with the book I can contribute some ideas for the mix, really. Also, I've been a bit worried about African debt. There are some countries that haven't sort of managed to fix debt situations in many years. You can point to countries like Sudan or Somalia that are still suffering arguably from the last crisis. And when you're in countries and you experience economic catastrophe, it's disturbing and tragic. So trying to find some ideas that would sort of help avoid the odd crisis, and if a country is in crisis, try and find a way out, is a key motivator. And looking forward, we're going to need more capital if we're going to achieve sustainable development goals and do meaningful climate adaptation. So there's a huge imperative to have a discussion, and I think that's what I'd like to contribute to. And I think lastly, what you mentioned a few of the perspectives I have, and they're quite important to me as someone in the markets, looking at Eurobonds on, with different prices flashing on screens, someone who's worked at the World Bank, and someone who's been in and worked in many African finance ministries. And in each of those roles, it's quite difficult to understand what's going on the other side. So hopefully these different perspectives enrich the information I've put forward.
Great. That makes a lot of sense, and I think we're going to try to cover much of what is in the book. There's a lot in there, and we will get to, I think, what you put forward and sort of assess around what does a path forward look like in the face of particular challenges right now. But there's a lot, I think, in terms of setting the scene that you do, and I want to spend quite a lot of time on that, frankly, because I think just trying to understand the current picture and how we got here, particularly on the side of a creditor landscape that looks quite different today in the region than certainly what it looked like a couple of decades ago. I think before we get into a lot of that substance, one of the things that you do in the book was very helpful to me was almost from a sociological perspective. You described the process of a sovereign debt issuance, what it actually looks like. I mean, it struck me for those of us who spend more time on the policy side, it's kind of like, we're spending all of our time looking at the traffic. We don't really understand how a car runs and under the hood. So I think it was useful for me just to hear the mechanics of that process, who the actors are, what it looks like. Can you just give us a few minutes on that as a starting point for this?
Absolutely. And I was very much in sort of an overseas aid role back in the early 2000s, and for me, South Africa was in the markets, Egypt and Morocco, but not many African countries were seen as credible. And then suddenly, the Seychelles puts out a small bond, and I think it was 2007 when Ghana and Gabon came into the markets and managed to raise many millions very quickly. And I remember at the time being quite fascinated by this. And now we've got 20 countries, African countries, active in the markets with bonds trading today. About another couple have issued and are not in the markets anymore. But this has been a huge change over that period. And I think it's fascinating because having sat in many quite tedious aid meetings at times, looking at sort of a disbursement of $30 million or something that was, and then suddenly a country can quite quickly raise $1 billion in global capital markets. And this process is, it starts, like, there are a few prerequisites in, quite often, I think almost all African countries have had credit ratings before coming to the market. So, you go through the process of getting those ratings, and then you put out a tender, and then you usually get the help of some investment banks to help you roadshow, as it's called. And suddenly, a minister of finance is flying around the world to New York, to London, and other financial centers, and they're doing many meetings in a day in fancy hotels. And what's fascinating is the pride and the tone of these meetings. So, an aid meeting, quite rightly, focuses on issues of poverty and health challenges and good governance and the problems with corruption. But a Eurobond roadshow, you might be in London, eating your lunch while these very flash presentations are put about transformation and growth and progress, and it's a very different narrative. And within a couple of weeks, a minister of finance might be $1 billion might be in their account, and then they can spend that as they choose. And that's quite a wonderful change for them, not only to have choices, but to go with that pride. And the sort of aid narrative of 15 years ago was quadrupling aid and providing choices, but it never did that. So there's a number of reasons why you kind of need to recognize market access as a success, as well as properly understanding the risks and some of the problems it might bring as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a good, again, it's a good starting point, particularly when, um, again, in a crisis moment, we don't hear the word debt without the word problem, the problem of debt. I think it's a useful reminder that in some respects, market access itself is, is something to be strived for. It's a sign of development success. And as you said, the dynamic around it actually feels quite different in a way that is no doubt better for developing countries and their governments. So let's go from there a little bit into this changing landscape. What the set of actors around a sovereign bond issuance, which can be a new phenomenon for some of these countries. It has been suggests that the creditor landscape itself has changed for these countries. And I think typically in discussions of this, there are sort of two set of actors that or two categories perhaps. that jump out as we assess that degree of change. One is the degree to which countries do now in Africa have access to commercial creditors, to bond markets, other lenders, and then China as a
Mm,
category of its own. Um, and I think we need to unpack both a little bit, even definitionally. What do we mean, particularly when we say China as a creditor? There is no single actor called China as a creditor.
mm,
But maybe as a starting point, you can just, and we can take them separately. But
mm,
let's talk a little bit about uh, how this picture has changed in terms of the
mhm,
constellation of creditors, particularly those two and what they've meant. Certainly the benefits that have been afforded, you've already alluded to that,
mhm.
but perhaps also the challenges
Yeah.
of a more complex creditor landscape.
Absolutely. So in terms of private creditors, what we've seen is we've got the Eurobonds, which are bonds denominated in foreign exchange. They can be in euro, but they're mostly in dollars, and that are issued in global centres, and they'll be listed on the Irish Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange. And these Eurobonds are traded and bought by asset managers and sovereign wealth funds and banks. And then we've also got syndicated loans. A bank will arrange a few different investors together and lend directly to a government. And here, the information flow isn't as good, but these are quite commonly taken by many countries in addition to the Eurobonds. And then another couple of areas is foreign investment in domestic markets has also picked up. And that's non-residents, foreigners buying in local currency bonds that are issued to local law. So we've seen those flows. Sometimes they're quite stable, and other times they're very quick and called hot money because they can come and go very quickly. And then lastly, we've got a lot of resource-backed lending from commercial creditors, which is usually based on oil or another commodity where it might be in sort of a delayed payment or something like that, but there's a lot of that going on as well. And while I've sort of set out the benefits, which is very important, we don't want to underplay the risks, and they are that this borrowing is generally very expensive, and that's why it's risky. And it comes with the foreign exchange risk. Much of it isn't in the you can't print dollars and euros in many African countries, in any African country. So you have that foreign exchange risk. And while you can borrow $1 billion quickly and do what you like with it, you also have to pay that $1 billion often back in one go. And that comes with repayment risk, which needs careful managing. And there is a lot of effort that's gone in to reduce that repayment risk, but we do not want to underplay how expensive commercial borrowing can be and how risky it is. And that's the commercial world. And then we do go into the official lenders, and that's the multilaterals, World Bank, IMF types, the African Development Bank, etc. And then we've got the official bilateral creditors. And China is a category in its own exactly. There are many different Chinese lenders. And in the book, I've got a whole chapter on China, and it is a theme that's through the book. But not to forget, there are other emerging lenders from the Gulf, India, for example, Brazil. There are many different countries who lend to African countries, and there are African countries lending to one another, which is an important theme. But China is very large, and its lending has grown so much, and that's why it should be such a big topic. And for me, I remember back in 2004, I was sat in the Ministry of Finance in Uganda, and where we used to park our cars, we were told to move them. And in that parking space was built this new big building, and it was a very Chinese design built by Chinese contractors. And I remember walking around this building, and it was eventually sort of used as a government ministry, and it had Chinese instructions on the fire extinguishers and things like that. So I've been fascinated in Chinese lending since then. And I remember the next year there was a G8 meeting, I remember in London, 2005, and it was all about make poverty history and commissions for Africa. But there was no mention of China as a lender. But at the same time, it was negotiating very large loans to Angola, which really, for me, started off the trend of increasing Chinese credit for African countries. Although it dates back to the 70s, the scale really lifted over the last 10, 15 years. Um, and I've written a lot on China, and I think one of the things that I find is I think there's a lot of media sensationalism. It's a heavily politicized topic, so there's a lot of, in my view, some really bad research China stuff. But at the same time, there's some wonderful books and papers, and it's just really hard to sift through it. And when I was getting my book reviewed, someone complained the chapter was a bit dull and balanced, but that's exactly what I wanted. I didn't want it to be a tale of debt trap democracy. I want it to be a tale of sort of balance, looking at it from different perspectives, and that's something I'm quite proud of. But it's an ongoing thing. We've got FOCAC, which is the big sort of jamboree with China and African countries right now when the new billions are pressed, and it's an evolving space. China's evolving as a creditor. China's evolving as a provider of debt relief. And there are big challenges, but there's also, again, been a lot of benefit from Chinese lending.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's and if we think of the trajectory here, sort of something I came across a while ago that I like a lot is it's descriptive. Is at the time of the HIPC debt relief initiatives 20 years ago, China was a smaller creditor to the HIPC countries than Costa Rica was, and of course, it is now the dominant official creditor. Um, I guess and we're going to come to sort of the challenge of providing debt relief or some form of restructuring where it is needed. But let's stick a little bit with maybe with I sort of teed it up with China as an official creditor, but also the category of commercial creditors. It does seem like, particularly in Africa, these two sets of actors are particularly important right now, and in fact, they have tensions between each other in a lot of these countries where key commercial creditors have their suspicions about China and China's behavior, and I think in equal measure, the Chinese lenders are concerned about the standing of commercial creditors. Could you describe that a little bit in terms of these dynamics? And how much is that sort of a leading dynamic, one in which perhaps what we would, the Paris Club creditors that historically played a big role, largely the G7 countries, perhaps are more on the sidelines in terms of the leading dynamics in a lot of these countries. So is that an accurate description of what we're seeing today, and how does it look different in terms of the behavior of these new leading creditors?
Yeah, I certainly see tensions in whenever debt gets to high levels and looks like it's going to be unsustainable, because every creditor wants to be repaid. And if it feels that other creditors are going to be repaid before them, and if it's offering greater concession, then it's certainly going to be unhappy. And I think that's where these tensions come from. So as in certain contexts where the pressures are there and a debt crisis might be likely, or at least has a decent chance, then creditors look to one another. And that's why there's you have to strive for comparable treatment and fairness in debt workouts to solve problems, because otherwise it's very difficult to get people to participate. So creditors are eyeing each other up. There's lending from many different sources. There's traditional lending from the likes of the multilaterals, who consider themselves senior creditors. And then there's the different creditors who basically want the money back they've lent, and each creditor could probably form an argument to say they haven't lent that much to the country, but when you add it all together, it might be too much. And that's where it's difficult. There's finger pointing, there's names, there's a lot of blame going around, and we saw that intensify in 2020 and earlier this year as these debt problems have become more acute. And I think there's been a huge effort over the last 20 years in terms of communication and publishing information. And those that are doing so, are rightly aggrieved that new creditors have come in and aren't providing the same level of information as them. And that alone can create pressures. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to coordinate creditors, to set a standard, if you like, for providing information and for coordination. But it's a difficult thing. And when you've mentioned the trouble about all of this, it's quite complex. It's not just China's lending, but it's the lending of many different policy banks, many different commercial banks, and along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that's just one country. And when we look at the private debt, I've pointed to the different types of lenders, the syndicated loans, the resource-backed loans, and then bondholders. It's a very diffuse bunch. You've got, in that hotel, who are listening to a minister of finance present, are some quite dedicated active managers who are studying the context and investing in African countries. But African debt's also in many indices, and the S&P 500 is an indice with 500 companies, and similar to that, we've got emerging market bond indexes with 80 odd countries in, and some people are simply deciding to invest in emerging markets, and in doing so they've bought bonds in Ivory Coast, they've bought bonds in Ghana, and they may not have thought through that carefully, and suddenly they are the creditor, someone who's just looking at passive investment in emerging markets. So it becomes very difficult, and at the other end, what's behind these asset managers is the global savers. It's people's pensions, it's people's savings, and they're effectively the ultimate owner of the asset. And so it's a really difficult landscape, and we shouldn't oversimplify it. And I think countries have, these restructurings take a long time because of this diverse bunch of creditors. But that said, I do see creditors evolving and making efforts, and we have to switch the forum from the Paris Club to the G20, because I think that is a forum which allows China a better place at the table, and there has to be effort along that way to sort of get creditors together, but it's no easy task.
And I want us to drill down really on some of these dynamics. But before we, I again, the association of debt with problems, and how do you deal with the problems, which is at the forefront of so much of the discussion today. Nonetheless, there still is an underlying question. I'm going to press you a little bit to form a summary judgment. But if we think of particularly the last decade and the emergence of these new creditors, and as really drivers in a sense of the provision of a lot of new sources of development finance, I mean, is it too complex to have a summary judgment in terms of benefits outweighing the cost? I think, frankly, when we spend so much time in dealing with the problem of debt workouts, we perhaps do lose some of what you said at the outset. But how should we think about what this has meant, the access to this financing, compared to perhaps some counterfactual where you didn't have the kind of access to markets we see today, China and other non-Paris Club creditors taking an interest in the region. Strictly from an economic perspective, what kind of judgments can we form about what this has meant for the trajectory of these economies?
In the African countries I've lived in and I've traveled in, it's very clear to me that a lot of work's needed to improve standards of living, to invest in infrastructure, to improve the quality of public services, be it in education, in healthcare, and that is the challenge to me. And you're going to need capital to do that, and it would be wonderful if there were ample amounts of long-term calm capital available that didn't incur any debt, but that's just not the case. So in a sort of practical sense, I look, where can you get capital? And I think that, yeah, you can look at debt, and at times it looks like the costs outweigh the benefits, and that's where I focus attention on improving the benefits and reducing the costs. That's my fix. It's not this sort of like, oh well, that didn't work out, market access was a good idea for a few years, but let's pay the bond back and walk away. Because what are you walking away to? You're walking to an aid dependency that doesn't provide enough capital. And we've got, African countries with millions of people joining the labor force every year that need, good healthcare. They need skills from education to provide the jobs. And when we claim demographics are a problem in Europe for sort of long-term economic health, then that demography in Africa could be a real opportunity. So in terms of these long trends, for me, it's about making it work and really making the most of these benefits. And as I said, pushing down on the costs. And I think that's where you've got to take the channels of investment that you have and encourage them, and they can be improved. So to me, it's not a sort of story of doom and gloom, and it's not about shutting doors. It's about sort of it's trying to manage those flows better and improve on the benefits they provide. And I see a lot of opportunity to do that. And had I think 20 years ago, no one that I've read, and I stand corrected, had sort of argued about, this quick shift to market access and the scale of Chinese lending. And I think at the time we were desperately looking at ways to scale up capital. People talked about trade and FDI rightly, but we just need to make this capital work. And I think the other one that comes to mind is remittances. African countries are exporting talent all over the world, and you see billions flowing back to some African countries from all these bright people they have working in different places. And that wasn't something that was also forecast, and it's happening. So all these different potentials for capital and investment need to be safeguarded and improved upon. And for me, one of the most important things is sort of capital generated within Africa. And there's a lot of literature on illicit flows, that, money that's come from corruption and mispricing and transfer pricing and whatnot, and being parked abroad, and that needs to be fixed. But I think the other thing I see is legal flows of money, capital generated in Africa being invested in other countries and overseas. And it'd be great that this capital was kept and invested around the continent much more. And I think that would provide a huge opportunity as well. So if we're serious really about sustainable development goals, and if we're serious about proper climate mitigation, then we need to encourage the flows of investment that we have.
Yeah, no, I think that's really an important message. So let me I want to shift a little bit, but I also want to note for our viewers that they can submit questions, and there's information on the screen on how to do that through Twitter, through the YouTube channel, and we'll be able to monitor questions that come in, and I will offer them up, perhaps with attribution. We'll see. But let's. I think there's also there's a significant problem that we take the problem itself of debt as gospel in sort of the standard measures of debt risk. So a few blocks from where I sit in Washington, we have the IMF and the World Bank, and they play this role in the system around debt assessments. And yet, again, it is if these judgments are written in stone and they are without controversy. But of course, that's not the case at all. They are judgments. There are formulas that are contested, debated, and ultimately adopted for assessing debt risk. I think it's worth spending some time on really understanding those things, because I think certainly from perhaps the perspective of any given African finance ministry, they might disagree with the characterization they are hearing from the fund or the bank on their debt profile, the risks involved. So maybe if we can try to unpack that a little bit, understand what the dynamics are, what goes into these risk assessments, what is open for debate, whether there are biases built in, how does it affect the ultimate outcomes?
Yeah, I think these types of debt alarms have been rung loudly since 2018, and more so since the COVID-19 pandemic has hit. And I sort of talk about in my book as the IMF being, and the World Bank in some other contexts, as being an umpire of these situations, saying whether debt's okay or is it out of hand. And they're an interesting umpire because often they're a player as well. So they're not only on the pitch blowing the whistle, but they're also a large creditor. So, and I think, what I wish is that we had like a Richter scale, where if there's an earthquake, you quite quickly know it's a number 5 or a number 7. But we just don't have that for debt, and the tools we have aren't perfect. And but at the same time, I think these DSA's debt sustainability analysis and these alarms, I think they're right for flagging these increasing debt risks. But at the same time, African debt is tiny compared to the rest of the world in dollar terms, but it puts a heavy burden when you start comparing it to the size of economies, that is over GDP, or the size or interest payments compared to revenue, or for example, the money that's earned from exports in terms of external debt service. So these indicators sort of enrichen the discussion. And the difficult part is debt sustainability is a really complex thing, and it does require judgment. It's an art rather than a science, and that goes for a country, a sovereign credit rating or these sort of debt sustainability. And to me, it's very, very country specific. And I tend to diagnose debt problems differently in my work as a fund manager. I sort of look at them as export problems. I look at them as revenue problems or investment problems. And then I try and help work out how they might be fixed and whether a country has the ability and the willingness to pay. And I think while the multi-country tools and rules of thumb are useful, you do need to do a lot of work at the country level to make a meaningful assessment. And I don't think you can quite easily poke holes in the IMF and World Bank DSAs, but it's really hard to come up with something better that covers many countries. And I think they've done an incredible job in that manner. So for me, there's something that needs to be supplemented rather than ignored, for example. And again, here we can still make improvements. The debt landscape changes, so the debt sustainability assessments should change. And for me here, it's sort of evolution, not revolution. And at times, it looks to me like the way countries are assessed is more operational convenience for the World Bank and IMF. For example, if you get concessional financing through one of their windows, you're what's called a lower income country candidate, even if you're a middle income candidate. And then if you don't get concessional money, you're suddenly a market access country. And so you've got one DSA that covers Belgium and Angola and in the same framework, and the other one's comparing a country like Ghana with some market access with a country that's completely aid dependent. And so what I'd like to do is sort of tweak the system to allow for a kind of frontier market DSA that sort of does a better assessment of countries that have got maybe a foot in the market, but it's not properly secured. It's not a full-on, let's say, emerging market. It doesn't have the war chest of reserves or the domestic debt markets yet, but you need to design something for those. So, but on the whole, I think they're good but difficult to do. And the trouble is the pendulum swings quite quickly. 1 minute we're encouraging private capital to invest in an Africa rising narrative, and the next minute we're saying, oh, there's massive debt problems. And these signals aren't always perfect because it does put people off, but then you need to be real about the risks involved. So it's a difficult narrative to manage. And there are many different countries. Some African countries have come through the COVID pandemic so far with extremely strong macro and a lot of resilience, and others are really suffering. And as I said, there's still countries that have been suffering over the past decade from debt problems that we still haven't resolved. So we've really got to break it down and look at things country by country.
Thanks. That was very helpful. Would you, and let me press you maybe to be even more, a bit more controversial. I guess when it comes to the work of the bank and the fund, even the work of ratings agencies, you were looking at Africa as a region. You've already acknowledged, I think, the diversity of the region in terms of different types of economies. So beyond categories of countries that are emerging, not emerging, however we want to slice that, is there a regional bias in the work of assessing debt risk that is a problem for Africa? That if we really step back and look at this, we certainly hear this from the region, frankly, that that they're not, frankly, getting a fair shake when it comes to these kinds of assessments.
Yeah, I think I hear that perception a lot, and I read about it in social media and even research. I don't think there's so much good evidence to fully prove it, but I think I think it's something that needs to be explored. And what I, the one thing now, because we've got these bonds trading, we can compare, a bond from an African country with one in Central America or in frontier Asia, for example, and make comments about the cost of borrowing through the yields and the prices of those bonds. And one thing I find in my research is that that generally the credit ratings sort of reflect that. But the follow-up argument to that is the credit rate are the credit ratings fair? And you see some criticism of credit rating agencies as having a bias towards Africa. My view is that especially with the market debt, it's a bit too early to say, because if we do go in the next few years into a systemic crisis where we had many defaults, you would look at the credit ratings and you say they were going in the right direction when they dropped. But if things are fine, then you could argue that they were too tough and too aggressive. And what we haven't got is a history of default. LATAM countries were defaulting in the 1930s. They were, they've and in the 1980s on market debt. But really, and obviously, most African countries won their independence in the 1960s, and the debt problems of the 80s and 90s were very different. It had a very official nature. A lot of the commercial debt that countries borrowed was through export credit agreements and some bank lending. But the new debt landscape has changed, and what we haven't got is the data. So it's something to watch. But one other thing I do is, if you look at if you look at a Eurobond issued by an African country and what's in the price, and you've got the risk of the probability of default, which is hard to calculate. You've got liquidity. The debt borrowed is way smaller than in other countries, so it's a little bit trickier to buy and sell. And then there's a big chunk of uncertainty. And this is where I think we need to make effort. And I think it's in reducing this uncertainty that we can reduce the cost of African borrowing. And African countries are making great progress with their macro over the decades. They're communicating much better. And one thing I found for countries in the Eurobond market, that I get way better information from ministries of finance and central banks from my desk on their websites, from when I visit and discuss things with them. And the media is so much better. I can take the British media, for example, where you go back 15, 20 years and the reporting on Africa was just dreadful. It was mostly about famine and disaster. But now you get some really insightful pieces on economies, central banks, interest rate decisions, currency movements, and the sophistication of reporting. So what I'm seeing over time is that uncertainty will drop with familiarity. And many fund managers are criticized for being kinder to LATAM because they know the context, they travel there more regularly. But I'm kind of hoping over time that uncertainty for Africa drops. And I am seeing good progress with information flows. So it is tough, but I think we are moving in the right direction.
Thanks for that. So it sounds like, maybe Africa suffers from a newness bias.
Mhm.
I guess the question will be over time, particularly if we compare it to Latin America, where there seems to be a tolerance for defaults in the
Mhm.
markets. Does that bear out in Africa too? I'm monitoring questions coming in, a lot of good questions.
Mhm.
I think one related to something you were just saying is sort of question around the state of capacity. That's often a vague term around governance issues, but basically, we know economic performance has been good in the region in the past decade. What has sort of basic debt managed capacity looked like, and what's the evolution of that? I presume we are in a better place today than we were in the past, in terms of the sophistication of ministries and the agencies that are tasked with managing these processes. Do you want to characterize that?
Mhm. So when I talk about sort of capacity and the performance of debt management offices, I think it's not for a lack of bright people. There's plenty of bright people. Sometimes it's hard to get them into government because of pay scales. They might be in the private sector, they might be working abroad. So you've got a sufficient pool of bright people, but sometimes you're not you need to put them in the right place. So I think with debt management, you've got to create a small center of excellence, and I think that's been done very well with central banks. I think, often pay scales are better and you have lots of bright people working in central banks, but it's been harder in some government ministries to attract talent, and those that are working there are under lots of constraints, be it, they're too many things without the resources, for example. So with debt management offices, we've seen a huge improvement. You can point to many different African countries where debt management offices have been formalized from what would have been like aid liaison departments 10 years ago, and are doing much more of the work. And a lot of credit goes to the technical assistance provided by the World Bank and IMF, and also from regional technical assistance centres. There's a bunch called MEFME based in Harare, which fly around the continent doing wonderful training courses with different debt management offices. But we need to do, I think, with debt management offices, we've got that started, but there's a lot of problems with you need to modernize the debt management office, because I call it active debt management. So passive debt management to me was waiting for a donor to invite you to a meeting and tell you what they're going to do. They're going to lend you 20 million to build this bridge. And you're there to sign the agreements, but not much is asked of you. You're never asked about the terms and conditions. You're told this is how we lend. So suddenly you need, and I think to sort of raise people's games, you need to ask them to make choices. And that's what I think some of the market debt does, in that it forces a country to talk about what maturity of debt they want, what interest rate they want, and that's based on the length of debt or the size of the borrowing, or some of the different terms. And I think these choices, and then as soon as you've issued the debt, which I talk about, there's a huge follow-up. And what I've seen over the last 2 years is many different African countries coming back and issuing debt, not to and to pay off other debt. So you're sort of managing your debt portfolio actively. So you're borrowing at a lower cost to pay off a more expensive piece of debt, or you've seen a big spike of repayments in 2024, and what you want to do is take that chunk and spread it out in the future, so you lower repayment risk. So this active debt management takes a lot of skill, and I'm seeing countries develop that. But again, we have to go further, and I think there's a lot of help when a country is in distress, because they tend to pay advisors. There's help when you issue a bond, because you pay banks to help you. And then there's this middle gap where I think countries need a bit of support. And that quite often, I think, with the multilaterals, there's this idea that countries shouldn't borrow from the markets, they should borrow from us. And if we help at this point, we are encouraging it, and that is a bad thing. But my view is that the support should be forthcoming, and that's where it's needed. So, and I think if we go to the African countries that aren't in the markets and are dependent on concessional borrowing, and should be dependent on concessional borrowing because it's much cheaper, they should be a lot of choices involved. So we should be working on fostering the quality of debt management by saying to a country, we're going to provide a loan, but you have to determine the terms and conditions as part of a negotiation. And I think that's very important. So, and that again will help countries look at the debt portfolio they're taking on, the risks about it, and if in future they are taking on more expensive or risky debt, they have that skill set partly developed. And then the other part I think is very important in all this is use of proceeds, is what you do with the money. And I think when you're borrowing at expensive rates, it needs to be invested extremely well. And I think that's the big gap at the moment. And that's public investment management. Governments didn't have the choices in Africa in the 80s and 90s largely. They were investing quite heavily in the 70s, but a lot of these dreams were cut off by the crisis of those 2 decades. And those choices have come back. And I think what hasn't happened since the debt relief of the early 2000s is progress in public investment management. And the challenge is to get a Columbia type system of designing, implementing, and evaluating public investment management into African finance ministries. And I think that's where debt benefits improve, when you get the use of proceeds right. And that's even more important as we shift into a world of like sustainable financing. We've got African countries issuing green bonds, sustainability bonds, where use of proceeds is very important. And more we need that capacity. So when I'm talking about debt management capacity, I'm not only talking about sort of managing the loans and making those choices, I'm also talking about public investment And it's that capacity in those offices, I think we've got the biggest challenge ahead.
And on that last point, I think it's an important one. In fact, we have a question related to sort of a question of where does the money go? It's sort of a simpler version of what you just described. Um, what about the choice of creditors in that regard? What effect does that have? I mean, in my own mind, I can think of a World Bank project loan that, from the perspective of a lot of client countries, is quite onerous, with a lot of hoops to jump through, all in the name of accountability, in a sense. But maybe if we frame it as a government that is borrowing its own accountability to its citizens, what about the choice of creditors? How does it affect that? Of course, we have then a lot of allegations around Chinese lending, the lack of transparency, and the implications of that. Just maybe say a few words about that.
Um, I think you're always going to have to jump through hoops is something I think of, and if it's for concessional lending, and if it is tough and tiresome, then it's still probably worth it, because you've got, cheap borrowing comes at a concession. Someone somewhere else is taking risk on your behalf by issuing investment grade bonds and then on lending to you. So if you can get that cheap borrowing, you're going to have to jump through hoops at some point. And then it's a question of, I think that at the center of it, there's responsibilities on all sides, from both creditors and borrowers, but the borrower is in the middle. And I think if a borrower can make a solid plan and build a very solid, sustainable brand, they're going to be able to turn around to the different types of creditors, whether they're commercial, whether they're official, whether they're from China or from the United States, and say, look, we've got this plan and we're going to deliver on it in this way. And we want you to invest in these things. So quite often it's smart suits pitching up to Ministry of Finances with their own idea and their own financial backing that gets signed. But it kind of needs to be flipped back the other way. And we don't have many countries delivering on that quality of plan and brand at the moment. But I think the countries that get it right are going to do very well. There are many billions of dollars looking for a sustainable home, as people rightfully demand that their pensions are invested not only for financial returns but for environmental good, for social benefit, and in good governance situations. And likewise, as the multilaterals evolve, hopefully into institutions that support the climate transition and climate adaptation, that they're going to have to find these opportunities too. So I think the work happens there. And I think if you can get this brand right, then you can force creditors to do what you want, and because they're looking for opportunity. And I think that, so it's a bit of effort from both sides, I think. And because if you've got a pipeline of investment ideas, then you can turn around to investments and say, these are the things we want supported. We've designed these projects. And in terms of domestic accountability, that's absolutely huge. And they need to be on the Ministry of Finance website. They need to be out there. So domestic think tanks, parliamentary committees, interested citizens, radio show hosts, whoever it is, can look at it and say, I dislike or like those 5 priority projects, and we can have a conversation about them before they're signed. And maybe that improves the design and puts people under pressure to get the cost right and make sure there is local content for domestic contractors and jobs, to make sure that these haven't been procured at alarming costs. So in summary, it's sort of take a bit of control, and I think that domestic accountability with this plan and this brand are really, really important.
Yeah, that's great. I have to say, in the work, even that we've done at the center on debt over the years, one thing that has struck me consistently is how important local journalists are to this story in so many cases, that they really are the ones, if they are doing strong analytical work in their reporting and investigatory work, it can yield a lot. Okay, well, look, so before we have to end at the hour, I do want to make sure we spend some time on the problem issues that
Mhm.
basically, to take the title of your book, avoiding burdens of debt. And then when you do reach a point of a burden, what do you do about it? So why don't you take us a little through, again, from this perspective of different stakeholders,
Mhm.
and particularly in the current climate, what should be happening? Who are the key actors that have to have some responsibilities for addressing the problem of debt distress today?
Mhm. I think there's many different stakeholders, and we're all working towards what in the book I describe as sort of better borrowing, and that's transparent borrowing with lots of information for accountability. It's deeper domestic markets rather than borrowing in foreign currency. It's more flexible financing that doesn't demand repayment right in the middle of a crisis and does have that flexibility. There are sort of parachutes for countries, market access parachutes that might be in short-term trouble, a much tighter use of proceeds, as I've discussed, and this move to sort of solid plans and sustainable brands. So there's that better borrowing, and for that to happen in the book, I talk about the different stakeholders. There's the borrowers themselves, which have a huge amount of work to do. There's the creditors, and they're sort of two parts of the story which need to work towards this better borrowing. But we've also, the others I talk about are the global savers, who are the people, the people in many countries whose pensions are invested in African sovereign debt, and that's pension funds in Joburg, in Lagos, but also all over the world that might be now invested in African debt. And we have a responsibility to demand that our money is invested invested well and not just for financial returns. And then we've got what I call the umpires. I discussed the IMF and their DSAs, debt sustainability analyses, and they've got a very important role. But also the architects, and these are the people sort of designing these common frameworks and debt workouts, improving the legal contracts about debt, pushing for transparency. And these architects are doing a fantastic role to try and sort of improve this landscape. And I think we do have an opportunity to avoid some debt crises, but I think some are inevitable. They will come, but they will go, and we can get better at the way they're managed. So I don't think there's some magic bullet and miracle cure. If you look at most countries' history, be it in Latin America or Asia, there's a lot of trouble along the road before you find a sustainable debt path. And when you look back further in academics work, you see it for many defaults in among European countries, and we're only a few years away from a European sovereign debt crisis. So, it's something. There are debt problems that never go away, but some countries have found that better balance and maximize some of the benefits and reduce some of those costs. And I think there does the there's and I think for an immediate step, I think the analogy I bored everyone to tears with in Lusaka by repeating it again and again was that the country was driving down bad roads in a flashy sports car, and it was screeching around corners and making incredible progress. So it seemed, but this was a bad road with potholes, and the idea was to sort of move to a more robust vehicle that could deal with the fact that there were difficulties, there were potholes, there were roadblocks, and this vehicle wouldn't swerve off and would survive the journey. And that involves sort of saying no to a lot of the time for loans, and only saying yes when the conditions are right, and it fits priorities. And we see Zambia today has signed a program with the IMF, and the new government's making really good progress at trying to resolve its debt crisis. But what not only, with Zambia, it's in a debt crisis and it will need to restructure, which in my view is going to be tricky given that the many different creditors involved. But we don't want to stop there. And the reforms need to be put in place so that as they sort of hopefully regain market access and regain access to creditors in the coming years, that it's not business as usual, and we don't repeat the same mistakes, and that we have shifted to a robust vehicle that is basing its borrowing on a solid plan and is looking at the road ahead. It's expecting surprises and shocks, and we've no idea what the next crisis will be. whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster or a climate shock, a global financial crisis, we haven't really got a clue. What we just have to have in our mind that we've got a plan to sort of deal with that as best we can. And I think that sort of honesty needs to happen, and as countries rebuild, and at the same time, there are wonderful options to call in the cavalry from the official sector, and they've done an incredible job during this last 2 years to provide net financing incredibly quickly, and that's a huge positive. And but the same, but we just and we can continue to look for improved ways of delivering that. So it's a there's a lot of work to do from a number of people, and I guess I would have said that in 2019, and the pandemic has even has made it even harder, because debt burdens all over the world have been raised over the past 2 years, and in some countries debt has peaked perhaps and stabilized, and in some countries we haven't got to the peak yet. And as we grapple with the remaining variants and vaccination challenges ahead of us.
So I want to close out with and ask you about the state of the common framework. But before I do,
Mhm.
I really wanted to get to this question because it's been on my mind, and you spend some time in your book on it, what you refer to as the market access parachute. So namely, the use of guarantees from bodies like the World Bank. But you even, you describe the history of the U.S. sovereign bond guarantees, which is
Mhm.
the offer of a full guarantee in a number of countries. Can you describe the sort of the potential for those kinds of instruments, and what does seem to be a lack of take up, frankly? You described the case of
Mhm.
Ghana, and the use of a partial guarantee from the World Bank that didn't seem to have a very satisfying outcome.
Yeah, I think when debt doesn't appeal, you can enhance it. And you can typically enhance it by putting something behind it. In the Brady era of the 1980s, the US Secretary, it was US securities that backed that money, that made them appealing to market participants. But someone somewhere has to infer a cost. Someone needs to be able to put that on their books for a while, and I think that's the challenge. A guarantee may not be called, but at the same time it might be. It's a liability. So the US government in the place of the Brady era put up a lot of collateral, as they did through the US aid loans that have happened over the last 20 years, and many still exist today, and I don't know what the future of them is. And yes, we've seen some World Bank partial guarantees of bonds, some more successful than others. I think the syndicated loan transactions have been much better to date than the bonds, but it's not to say that the bonds with the right thinking could go ahead much better. But again, with all these ideas, and you see some fantastic ideas coming from the UN Commission for Africa about improving liquidity, about improving and reducing the cost of African borrowing. But all of these ideas require someone to put up some cash. And that's really hard to come by at the moment. And quite quickly, we always get back to special drawing rights, because they're like a free way of providing money. And that's good. But to me, that always signals that means no one wants to put up the cash, because you revert back to that idea of sort of making money miraculously through the SDR framework. So I think a country in trouble, if it's got hard-won market access and is running out of steam, that there is a role to play for a parachute to help them land safely or to guarantee market access. But again, someone has to come in and put up the cost. And the multilaterals, the African Development Bank, could do this, I think, in an effective manner. There might be policy requirements to reduce moral hazard, but I think it's an important part, and we need to look at these as modalities we can utilize over the next 5-10 years.
Great. So just a few minutes left, and I promised this closing question on the common framework. So maybe let me pose it this way. We have 3 country cases, I think all
Mhm.
African countries, that have availed themselves of the common framework process under the G20. Uh, what's your judgment about how that's going? What have we already learned about this as sort of the next generation of coordinated debt relief?
My view is that the common framework is a couple of terms on a couple of bits of paper that have been published. but there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of questions on how these terms will be played out. Are all the terms going to be implemented in full? So we don't really know what the common framework is yet. So the only real way we'll know about the common framework is how the initial situations play out. And we've got three very different ones. We've got Chad, who is a country that's undergoing quite a lot of political uncertainty after its 3-decade-long ruler died earlier in the year, and it's been dealing with its debt problems and restructuring over the last 4 or 5 years. And we've got official creditors, Paris Club types, but also India, Saudi Arabia on the committee, and China, among others. And then we've got Glencore, a commodities company, who have debts of about $1 billion. And sort of it's difficult for me to track how those negotiations are going and how these oil loans that were made 6-7 years ago will be relieved. So you've got a difficult situation there without much information, but I track it as best I can. And then you jump to Ethiopia, who sort of decided to sign up for the common framework really at a time where their debt sustainability was there was some risk about it, but it certainly wasn't in distress. They had a bond trading quite well and the markets didn't perceive that. But over the last year, the country has taken a step into what appears like a very, very tragic conflict and humanitarian crisis. And so again, we've got a debt problem, but we've got a bigger problem of conflict and humanitarian behind the scenes. So these are not easy situations. I think Zambia is the third one, and Zambia's obviously had this wonderful change of government. It's gone from a path which looked worryingly towards a single party state, towards the youth of Zambia voting in a party to offer it better opportunities, which I think is wonderful. And they've made the right steps so far, but there's a huge challenge. And Zambia is interesting. Ethiopia is just one Eurobond, but Zambia's got 3 big Eurobonds in the market, a ton of Chinese debt, about a third of the external debt stock from many different Chinese lenders, syndicated loans, lots of multilateral debt. So it's the full portfolio, and we'll learn a lot from how the Zambian restructuring plays out in 2022. So at the moment, as I say, it's the common framework becomes the result of these debt fixes, and then I think how severe they are on creditors will impact, or sovereigns will impact, how many sovereigns decide to take up the framework in future, and whether it becomes something you do if you're in doubt or something you only do when you're completely on your knees. But those all things are yet to be discovered.
Okay. We're going to have to close there. I want to apologize. We had a lot of good questions come in from the viewers. We couldn't get to all of them, but we always appreciate having those questions. The book is Where Creditors Do, How Africa's Debt Can Be a Benefit, Not a Burden. I encourage viewers to go read the book, see if we did it justice in this short hour. But thank you, Greg Smith, the author, for spending the hour with us and having this really, I think, enlightening conversation.
Thank you very much.